Is it possible for a less than 1 hour episode of television to leave you with a hangover? The answer is clearly yes, because I have not stopped thinking about episode 4 of Heated Rivalry since I pressed play last night. I don't think my heart has stopped racing since then, and it sped through so much in this episode and also illuminated a lot of the conversations we've been having since the series started in terms of what is making it such a successful adaptation so far and furthering that and heightening that, as well as placing itself and kind of positioning and making clear the position it sits in within the narrative structure and why episode 3 in particular was in the place that it is. I have so many thoughts about this episode, and as usual, they are just going to barely scratch the surface, but I hope you will humor me in kind of talking through some of this, and I kind of want to frame this around the structure while also getting into the minutia to whatever detail, but I think there is just so much at play here, and I'm really enjoying the focus of this story. And I think that a lot of the press that I've seen from Jacob Tierney, especially even within the last week, has really reinforced a lot of this. He has spoken really candidly about this being a romance, treating it as a romance, and leaning into the joy, as well as within an interview in a hockey podcast, I think within the last week, talking about the promise of that happily ever after at the end, though I don't know if he used or don't remember if he used the HEA specifically. And I think all of this is important within the kind of structure that we're looking at here. And so we have the promise of that because we are in the trenches, as romance readers know. We are in the emotional mire of it in episode 4, and we end the episode around 46 to 48% through the book. So we do still have some space to cover, as well as Scott and Kip's story to finish up, but we've also covered a lot of ground within the book as well, and focusing on these emotional beats and changes and the way that the show is utilizing the medium to support the emotional beats and changes of these characters and of this story, rather than feeling like it is something that needs to be fixed, and kind of taking the strengths and weaknesses of either storytelling medium and kind of fitting in the groups of them. For instance, from the page to the screen, we're not going to see or have as much intimate knowledge of that internal dialogue between our characters, which is going to be a stumbling block in some cases. However, with the screen, we have the ability to see their faces and for the emotion of everything to land even more significantly and to be faced with it in a completely different way. And so I am really, really excited about this episode. I think it's one of the best episodes of television I've seen in a long time. I can't remember the last time I had an episode that had me running the full gamut of emotions like this one did, from straight up almost giggling at the beginning to, gasping to wanting to scream at the end, and going on that journey and the breakneck pace of it while still being very concise in its storytelling, but also not rushing through any of the beats in terms especially of the tuna melt scene of it all. And I also think the positioning of it and the kind of bookends of 2 and 4 on either side of 3 is very important, because we have some really significant parallelism between episodes 2 and 4, as well as I think we need 3 to contrast against 4 in terms of the world we're looking at and the emotional journeys, as well as the timeline. And so I am just as excited about the structure that we have found in terms of how we're structuring these episodes, even as it is incredibly stressful while still trusting the process, because I think it's finding these really high emotional beats and really shaping this story and this very episodic story in a way that has such clear arcs from episode to episode, and those arcs are in such interesting conversation while obviously serving the emotional stories of these characters, and I am just thrilled by it all. Very kind of vague overview, obviously, but before we dive into the specifics of the episode, hi, my name is Melody, and we talk about books and book adjacent things on this channel. We have been diving in to Heated Rivalry a little bit more specifically the last couple of weeks, and if that sounds of interest to you, I would love for you to like and subscribe and hang out a little bit longer. And with that, let's move into episode 4, Rose, where we are catching back up with Shane and Ilya and their story, though after a couple of years, or with a couple of years under our belt within the first however many minutes of the episode. And this is too where we see the parallelism come into play. With episode 2, we are given the recap by Shane, and with episode 4, we are given the recap from Ilya, which also reflects who was having the emotional crisis in the episode, whose emotional journey we are a little bit more closely tied to in terms of that vulnerability and kind of who is the most emotionally open for the episode. So Ilya is the more emotionally open person in this episode, and we see the inverse to his freak out in episode 2 here. And I think it really sets up the partnership between these two and the emotional journeys for both of them in terms of reaching their HEA inevitably. And I think it works so, so well. And so we start the episode with a montage that is very reminiscent of the montage that started episode 2. However, and this goes into one of the big changes that was talked about and confirmed via some interviews in between these episodes, in that Shane and Ilya in between episodes 1 and 2 were not hooking up in the same way that as book readers we would expect them to, that the first time in episode 2 was the first time, and so they were texting each other, and that was kind of the lead up to that. And so here we are seeing that texting interspersed with more active hookups as we kind of experience them in the book, and it is also used as a way to kind of move time forward. So we skip a couple of years, or cover a couple of years, I should say, within the course of this, and it establishes things so, so well. The cuts of it, the energy of it, we get the full sense of the dynamic that has sustained between these two for these last couple of years, the way that they play on and off the ice, and the level of comfort that they're starting to develop within the sense of that physicality, again, both on and off the ice. The cuts of them kind of slamming into each other while playing hockey, contrasted against another kind of slamming, perfection. But we also get to see a kind of level of joy that I think is really important in relation, or in contrast to the joy that we see in episode 3, because Shane and Ilya's joy is going to take a much different shape, and it's much more delicate, as we see in relation to Shane within the tuna melt scene specifically, which we will get into in more depth. So I love this montage, and I love the musicality of this show. I love the use of montage in this show in a way that actively moves things forward. It's fun, it's fresh, it speaks to my musical theater sensibilities. It again plays into trusting us as the viewer, because we are expected to be paying attention to that montage. And it's also just fun for a show that is really relishing in its fan edits, or inspiring a lot of really inspired fan edits. I think that that is the kind of energy and kinetic energy that we're bringing to the table. And again, it just does a lot of character work in a short period of time. And so we don't have to see those repetitive hookups. We aren't really seeing those necessarily in the book either. I think this is doing a lot of the work that the prologue does in the book in terms of establishing the baseline of where their relationship has been sitting, and the comfort of that, because it's familiar. And Shane in particular is very comforted by the familiar, even as we see much more investment from them emotionally than they are surely willing to admit. The way that they are checking in with each other, the way that Ilya is the first person potentially we see Shane text after he wins the Stanley Cup, the way that Ilya is watching him still on television in a mirror to the way that Shane is watching clips of Ilya in episode 2. And so we get that real balance. Additionally, I know I referenced this in episodes 1 and 2, but this is the most exciting in terms of like the musicality, and especially once we get to the end of the episode as well. In terms of the queer folk of it all, obviously this is a much different show, but one of the things that really was exciting for me as a viewer with that show is the way that music and editing to the music worked to heighten the emotions and the emotional storytelling at any given point. And I think that that is a real strength of this show that, again, also helps illuminate some of that interior work that we are not going to get as actively. And so over the course of this montage, we're watching these characters kind of settle into their lives and become adults in a lot of ways. We really see the growth of those 2 years, even if Shane is really still kind of awkward in himself, and that's a large portion and conflict of this episode of the show. I think that it really establishes them, and you can feel them feel more grown in this episode, which is a real feat because there's, not as many, makeup things you can do to kind of show that for a character. And I think there's also just the physicality of it, I think cannot be understated. And I really enjoy that. Both the physicality for these characters and themselves, but also the way that they are physical with each other, but also the way that that contrasts depending on the situation. And the minute the emotions become different, especially for Shane, than he was expecting, that becomes a much more precarious situation. But that's getting ahead of ourselves a little bit. And so we are seeing the kind of responsibility for Shane in this episode that we see for Ilya in the second episode. And we're seeing the real kind of like weight of responsibility that Shane is feeling, as well as the kind of distance he feels from his friends a little bit in the scene with Hayden, where Hayden is trying to set him up with someone. And even as that opening montage was going on and I was like grinning, I was also like, what a gift this is, knowing the emotional devastation that we were in store for based on where we were going with the rest of the episode. And I think that having that kind of juxtaposition was really important, and it was important to be able to start with those moments of joy before the crisis, and that the joy brings the crisis in some ways. And again, we're seeing this joy contrasted against the joy of episode 3, which was also complicated, but we're also seeing the idea of Shane complicated here in terms of kind of the responsibility he's facing. He has all of these brand deals, but he doesn't really show himself as very confident in them, or we can tell that he's still not fully comfortable in his skin. And with the responsibility for Shane, we see with his conversation with Rose later in the episode how much of his life has been hockey. And so the weight of that, and hockey is all he knows, and the sacrifice of kind of conceiving of something that would threaten that, and how he kind of fits or feels himself fitting within hockey, within this kind of reconfigured idea of himself. And we also start to see some of the ideas of control for him sneak in. We see a kind of pushing up of the timeline of Shane being very concerned about his diet, and I think it makes sense in terms of being able to show the control he's trying to have. And we see this most with the metaphorical ginger ale, which, he's not allowing himself to drink. And once he feels like he has lost control, then we see him drinking, but also the idea of that and ginger ale representing comfort. But we're also seeing the real weight of responsibility for Shane and how he has kept himself distant from a lot of the people in his life, including his best friend, Hayden, but also that he's kind of keeping himself distant from himself in a lot of ways, and that Ilya represents the one place that he kind of allows himself to relax in whatever way. And of course, that is complicated. And so we have these real moments of emotional vulnerability and 2 and 4 that are paralleled with these 2 characters in a really satisfying way. And we also see a lot of parallels from the beginning of the episode to the end of the episode, kind of contrasting the joy and ease of the beginning of the episode with the real disquiet and desperation of the end, in a way that is just so smart and so satisfying and communicates so much with the limited time frame that we have within the space of the episode. And especially when so much of the pivotal scenes, speaking to the tuna melt of it all, are really still ripped largely from the book. And so of course the emotional crux of this episode really does come down to the tuna melt of it all, because that is where the emotional beats change. And the way that all of this was played was expert. And this scene in particular is an excellent example of the weight emotional stakes are given in this show, and the way that the entire production commits to them in a way that serves the story and heightens the feelings and results in, I think, the reception that we're seeing for this show, or why it's landing so well, because we're not pulling the punches, we're not cringing back in anticipation of this emotional vulnerability, and really exploring the emotional vulnerability is the heart here because Shane starts to question that, and the emotional vulnerability scares him off. And this is also an example of where the emotional intimacy is doing the driving of the plot and of the emotional journey, because it's about the emotional journey, obviously not the physical here. And I also think that we are really illuminating the spark between Shane and Ilya. I really enjoyed seeing the contrast of Shane and Hayden's friendship, and I think it would be so easy for the aquarium scene to feel like an easy cut or a throwaway, but I think it was so important for us to see Shane's world, and also the way that he's kind of keeping himself at a distance from those closest to him, and it kind of mirrors some of what we got in Russia with Ilya. And obviously we see a lot more of the responsibility that Shane is feeling the weight of as well. But also we get to see some of that friendly banter, and we can kind of feel the heartbreak of him holding so much of himself back from his friend and from himself. He's lying to himself about his feelings to a certain extent as well. Obviously, within the context of this episode, that is the main crux. But also, we see the banter between them a little bit. And I think it's important that we see this banter because I think it is a foil for the banter we see between Shane and Ilya. And so that we can see the banter without the charge and the sexual tension behind it to really further emphasize what the banter between Shane and Ilya is doing and the attraction between those two characters and how that works within their relationship and how it is a kind of way to avoid the fullness of some of those feelings, especially as we dive deeper into this scene, because we see Shane showing up at Ilya's place, the first time in his place. He also has a fantastic fireplace. I don't think we appreciate the fireplaces enough. And I think the contrast that we see in this episode or in this encounter is immediate, right? Because we feel the openness of it and the light of it. And the light was something I specifically called out in episode 3, the lightness to Scott and Kip's scenes and their ability to have their own space within the apartment and to see the joy and the light of that. We are then directly contrasting that with this scene with Shane and Ilya, where in essence it could be a similar thing, but it has a much different emotional connotation and it's much more emotionally vulnerable for them in a lot of ways. And I think we see this even from the way that the shot is set up as we're coming in, because we are so far back and we can kind of feel the emotional vulnerability of that. It feels exposed in some way. And so they have, their kind of normal interaction, and then Ilya plays his card and asks Shane to stay, which according to the author, we know is very intentional and has been meticulously planned by Ilya. And I think we get to see a lot more of that emotional range from Ilya within this scene, and getting to see a lot of that play out on his face was fantastic. And we see that play out even in the intimacy, both before and after the ask to stay, in that Shane is on top and so has a power position in whatever way over Ilya in that moment. And it's obviously not always symbolic, but it's definitely symbolic here. And so we have that emotional vulnerability from Ilya. We have that moment of them cuddling and taking a nap and him just watching Shane, which is beautiful and heart-wrenching, and I never would have expected to get that. And then we have him making him a tuna melt and offering him some ginger ale. And the idea, especially with the ginger ale, that he sees Shane, and we see then the discomfort that Shane doesn't know how to handle this. This is kind of outside the bounds of their relationship so far, and it's bounds that Ilya is clearly wanting to press, but he's also very aware of trying not to scare Shane off, and they're kind of like talking around the thing by talking about hockey. And you can kind of feel the discomfort of it. It's vulnerable in a way that these two who've been vulnerable with each other in so many ways, it's completely new ground, and it's shaking Shane to his core. And then you have the emotional distance of them on the couch kind of speaking just about hockey, and Ilya trying to kind of break down some of those barriers and also kind of suss Shane out as he starts to kind of ask questions about girls and just kind of gauge him, which is forcing Shane to kind of face some of this. Also, to go back a second, before the tuna melt scene, like right before, I think the last or one of the last lines of dialogue from Ilya we get to Svetlana is, "It's not that serious," and then cue him having bought an entire kitchen full of things to feed Shane, essentially, and trying to get him to stay the night and asking Shane if his ginger ale is cold enough in a way that kind of mirrors his check-ins in episode 2 as well. And also when they're talking about hockey, and again, a lot of the dialogue is lifted right from the book. I don't remember if I saw this dialogue when I was kind of checking last night, but Ilya makes a kind of throwaway joke about being lazy, which we see as an echo from what his father told him in episode 2. And Shane, kind of jokes it off or brushes it off right away. It wasn't really a joke, it was just told with a smile in a way to kind of undercut the seriousness of it. And that lands so well with Ilya. And the way that we see him smiling with Shane in a way that we don't, and just kind of like the facial kind of journey of Ilya in this episode, from the lightness that we see with Shane to the like harsh scowl after Rose is introduced. It's just a masterclass in jealousy and yearning. And so we see Ilya get a phone call from his father and have to kind of like shake himself out of the funk of that. So we still feel the weight of Ilya's responsibility, and Ilya's responsibility is still present over the course of the episode, obviously, in the same way that, Shane still has obstacles in episode 2, obviously. And just the mirror of it is so great. And the conscious choice that we see Ilya make to kind of like get back out there. And also the way that he goes to Shane for comfort in this moment. He bridges that divide that we saw, that expanse, that wide expanse on the couch, and goes to kind of sit closer to Shane. We see the parallel of the genetic when Ilya is flabbergasted or in awe of Shane knowing that he heard father correctly. And we see him kind of going to him for comfort, which is where we see the freakout start. And this both mirrors and deviates from this moment of intimacy that we see in the book in a way that I think is really interesting. We get the kind of petting of the hair and soothing from Ilya in that moment. I think the weight of his phone call with his father is felt much more in the show, and I think that's something that is really succeeding. I think we're feeling the fullness of these characters and those stakes a lot more because we're being faced with them much more head on, and we're being shown them in a way that is a little different than being kind of told about it through the narrative in a way that I think is really landing and helping to add to those emotional stakes. And so in the book, Ilya starts to pet at Shane a little bit more actively, where in the show, again, broad daylight, we see Shane kind of nuzzling and moving in, which again is putting him in a more powerful position in theory, but he's also very emotionally open in this moment and very vulnerable, which leads to the names and the freak out of it all. Now the names, obviously the first names, are a big deal. The audio of it was a little weird. I didn't feel like their mouths moved enough. I don't know if it was like dubbed in over. I don't know if maybe the audio of that take was corrupted or something. I don't know, but this is obviously the moment that freaks Shane out, and I don't think I was prepared for the emotional devastation from Ilya here. The way that he frantically tries to go back to Hollander, to kind of reset, to realize that he overplayed himself, and that he was in a moment of emotional vulnerability too. And so we see Vegas contrasted with this very specifically in terms of these freakouts after the emotion, because we see Ilya freak out after he gets a little forehead smooch. And then this, obviously this is forcing Shane to kind of confront a lot that he's been trying not to confront in terms of his own emotions and the seriousness of this. Even amid the freakout though, and before, well, I guess before the full freakout, he doesn't deny Ilya a kiss, but just the devastation of that, the move and the separation and the awkwardness of that and of that scene was hard. And so this is obviously a huge example of the physicality and this being a way that they are communicating, and this moment switching that and turning it on its head. And so all of the moments of intimacy really are serving the emotional journey of these characters and illuminating something. And I think that especially like the vulnerability of these kinds of moments that are awkward and hard, but we can be so in our head about. I'm so sympathetic to Shane in moments like this. And I think that we don't really get to see the fullness of that sometimes. And so allowing that to play out, I think, is just so true in terms of intimacy and these emotional journeys. And again, not discrediting them or undercutting it, allowing it to land with the full weight, especially because I do think that the intimacy of the moment, even before the names and the charge and change of it, did already start to freak Shane out a little bit. And in terms of the romance of it all, this is an excellent example of miscommunication, which we frequently see lambasted, or we frequently say that we hate miscommunication within romance. But again, this is just an example or proof that we just hate it done poorly, because these men have a reason to not be communicating well, and they have a language that they had been communicating in and had been on the same page, but this has shifted and they have to recalibrate. And Shane needs to figure himself out before he can be with Ilya, before we can get to the happily ever after. And so we see this kind of completely explode Shane's world. He doesn't know how to really think of himself anymore because he's having trouble grappling with the fact that he's gay. And this forces change into Shane's world. And again, we see Ilya with different women at the beginning, but we also get the sense through, or the framing of the montage makes it clear that it's always Shane at the front of his mind. And so we see Shane then actively pushing Ilya out of his mind and encountering the Rose of it all. And one thing I love about Rose and this book is that Rose isn't the villain. It would be so easy to pit a rival love interest against the, main love interest in a romance. And I think there's a couple levels to the heartbreak once Rose enters the picture, and that Rose as a character is doing a lot in a little bit of space, in the sense that we get the kind of juxtaposition and the contrast between Ilya and Shane's conversation and the awkwardness and the stiltedness of it, and the ease in which Shane kind of falls into conversation with Rose, even despite him really struggling with his sense of self at that point. And I think it's kind of foreshadowing how some of this will resolve, but it's also illuminating that for Shane, his entire world, at least that we've seen in the narrative, really has come down to hockey and to his affair with Ilya. And the stiltedness of the conversation with Ilya, which does have some elements of, if I loved you any less, I could talk about it more to it, contrasted with there being less stakes in the emotional sense for Shane in his conversation with Rose, so he lets his guard down just a little bit, but it's also allowing him to kind of open up generally. And it's also giving him a space to talk about the pressure that he's been under. He mentioned specifically, being the only other Asian on the team growing up. And we see so specifically with his brand deals, especially, what being the face of something means, and him struggling with being the face of something, and contrasting that public image with his private kind of conflict. And I like what the show is keeping with Rose. I like that Rose still comes across very lovable, and so we are just watching these characters that are lovable, that we can like and be rooting for, in this kind of just impossible situation, which makes it all the worse because there's no villain here. It's just these characters against the world, their feelings against their realities, and the struggle of that. And so I too, if I was Ilya, would be crashing out if I was seeing these paparazzi pictures of Shane and Rose, because Rose looks gorgeous and happy, and his man also looks gorgeous and happy, and it is rough. But at the same time, we can feel the tension with Shane, and that we see him unraveling in whatever way, and we are moving obviously toward the climax and the crux of it with the club scene, which we will get to. But with Rose, we see him adopting what he believes the world expects of him, what his best friend had just been talking to him about at the beginning of the episode, and really trying to fit within this mold that he expects of himself, and really try to chase away these emotions, because emotions are hard and the stakes are even higher for these two. And this moves us into a lot of the parallels that we start to see between the beginning and end of the episode. And we see Rose show up to Shane's game in his jersey, which I do not think we get in the book that I can remember, and I'm sure will inspire many a fan fiction. My only note there is I feel like the jeans feel wrong for 2016, but she looks cute in them, so it's fine. But we also push into the heartbreak of the difference between Shane texting Ilya at the beginning of the episode to texting Rose at the end, and having to scroll up for Ilya's last message chain and then kind of ignoring it, but still that is an inkling that he has, that he's still thinking about him in that moment. And just the devastation within the gameplay from Ilya, the difference between the physicality and the checking, and Ilya's kind of disassociation on the ice and his kind of refusal to look at Shane, but also always looking at Shane and letting him know through that physicality that he is hurt, and also kind of like reminding him that he is there. I thought it was just so well done, and we start the real tension that's going to propel us through the rest of the episode and not let up with the club and the tattoo of it all. The minute all the things she said started playing, my soul left my body. I knew exactly the kind of emotion we were living in, and I was terrified, and I had every right to be, because what an excellent ending to this episode. I was trying to think if there were any moments in Queer as Folk at Babylon that had me similarly feral and devastated, and I don't remember off the top of my head, but that would be like the closest I could place. At the same time, I loved that it felt kind of like a normal club, and we just felt the full emotional weight of it. And we start out with the franticness of the tattoo, the original version of all the things she said, and we are building this frenzy. We know the kind of dramatic irony that these two are going to end up in this place together. They haven't seen each other. There's all these festering emotions. Shane is still trying to be someone he isn't at the end of the day, and these two face off eventually on the dance floor. And while we see both sides of it to a certain extent in the book, I always felt like I read it much more from Shane's point of view, which is fair, but the level of emotion and range from Ilya in this scene is devastating. The moment, the turnaround to seeing Shane on the dance floor, and we obviously see some pretty significant deviation through the end. Also, the minute Shane notices Ilya, we have the song switch into the cover of all the things she said, which feels like a POV switch in some ways, but also changes the tone of the scene. We move from the kind of frantic energy into this kind of desperation, and the "this is not enough" refrain starts to feel like the inner monologue in a really devastating way, especially as we have a pretty significant shift in the end of the episode, in the sense that I think it was different than a lot of book readers were expecting, based on information that we have from the long game and from the way that we are revealed information in Heated Rivalry, because there is intimacy between Rose and Shane referenced as a thing that has happened in the past, but not active on page or something that we have to grapple with. And that, I think, is one of the main shifts that the storytelling requires, in terms of we have to kind of face that, because we can't really be told that in passing. We could, but the emotional weight of that is pretty significant. And I'm going to be very interested, because Shane's conversation with Rose is one of my favorite scenes in the book, I would say, or I think it's a fan favorite, if nothing else. And I'm going to be very interested to see how that feels after having seen this intimacy, and the weight of that carrying in. And I think it'll be fine, but there is the weight of that for sure. And Ilya's response to that matches the book, but what a way to end an episode. And again, the parallels reappearing in terms of that intimacy, with Shane following Rose up the stairs versus him and Ilya going up the stairs together at the beginning of the episode, or even racing up a different set of stairs in episode 2. And so again, we have these parallels with episode 2, but it's different. The stakes feel higher even in some ways, because they're older, and we have the weight of more of these emotions, and also the weight of all of the years in between that we're able to feel the weight of through that opening montage. And I think that opening montage is just masterful at kind of establishing the cadence of this relationship, and again, the kind of banter and the way that they kind of fall out of step with each other verbally and physically by the end of the episode, because they're both denying or refusing to speak these feelings in whatever way. And so we have, the kind of shape so far of their journey of like the meet, the Ilya freak out, the Shane freak out, very simplified, obviously, the kind of coming into their own in whatever way, the emotional vulnerability that's reversed. And then episode 5, we are going to have a lot to cover. I'm going to be very, very interested to see the shape of 5 and 6, and what beats we leave off on at the end of 5 in particular. just based on, the pacing of things and how much we have left to cover, how much of certain things in episode 6 we're going to get. We also set up a lot of what's to come, I think. We obviously, have really deepened the responsibility Ilya feels and like really referencing his father and his relationship with his father and his family and that complication. The kind of moment of him trying to shake himself out of that, I think was really powerful and is going to be a gut punch when that comes full circle. But even, like just the banter between Shane and Ilya in regards to the cup and who's going to win the cup and their win in relation to the cup by the end of the season, I think is going to look a lot different than either of them envisioned. We have Cliff really present again in this episode, and we have him kind of teasing Ilya in the first episode. We have that parallel too of Cliff teasing Ilya, the blushing of it all, and then Hayden teasing Shane and kind of calling him out, and both of them getting called out for their texting partner in a way that I don't remember from the book, but shows like how involved this really is. And anyway, so Cliff is more present, which I think, having seen that relationship a little bit more, especially in this episode with Ilya, and that kind of unraveling, if certain events transpire the way they do in the book, I think Ilya's reaction to Cliff is going to be very, very interesting. We get to see Shane's glasses and his boring hockey book. I was a little concerned about the glasses after Kip's glasses, because Kip's glasses were excellent. But Shane's glasses were also excellent and very 2016. And I'm just jealous of both men, because my glasses are a very high prescription, and they are not cute. But we have that set up. I'll be very interested to see if we get Ilya getting to see Shane in his glasses. I hope so, because it's something I love, but in terms of like the timing of it, we'll see if we get that FaceTime between Shane and Ilya. And I think there are ways to kind of consolidate that and work around that potentially. And we've seen in this episode just how much ground we can cover in very little space. I was looking at the remaining time, the entire time. Well, not the entire time, but while watching this episode, especially, before Rose was introduced, I was like, how are we going to do this? And we did it. So I have faith, and I think it's really comforting to have someone at the helm of this and a whole group of creatives behind it where we can have that faith. I am expecting changes going forward, but also knowing how ripped from the page so many of these scenes and beats are, I trust that those changes are very specific and made very intentionally, and also made in service of Shane and Ilya's love story. And I think, again, we see this emphasized by the way that production choices are being made to really support all of the emotional work going on. For instance, in the club scene, we see the camera work of that. We see the pulling back as these two are staring at each other from across the club. We see that distance and can feel that distance, only to be slapped in the face with the extreme close-ups of them in a moment of intimacy, not with each other, but feeling them thinking of each other in a way that I think is so hard to communicate. Like, you can say on the page, this person was thinking of this other person, but to see that come into focus so starkly, again, the use of light during the tuna melt scene. I know, like, when those stills first dropped, everyone was trying to figure out, like, did Shane actually stay the night? Because I personally had a perception of that scene that wasn't lit like that, but it allowed for the discomfort of that, I think, to read more clearly, and for it to be this representation of these emotions kind of being put out into the daylight in whatever way, not being able to hide from them. And again, all of that distance between them in those scenes and the kind of pulled back wide shots of it, and the way that it was shot. Again, it's been a second since I was in or took a film class of any kind, but it allowed for that vulnerability through that space rather than the intimacy. And there was the vulnerability in the real intimacy at the beginning. And so we're getting to see the kind of contrast of that. And we also have the contrast of emotional intimacy very specifically with Scott and Kip in episode 3, immediately followed by this episode and Shane and Ilya. And so we go from Scott being really intense and asking for that emotional intimacy from Kip right away, and them being emotionally vulnerable and open with each other other and the world still impeding on that, but the openness of that contrasted with Shane freaking out about a ginger ale and a first name and the real struggle of that emotional intimacy, and that both of these couples have obstacles to their happily ever after, but the way they handle the intimacy differently, I think, is a really fun juxtaposition and in conversation with each other in a way that is only made possible through the structure of this season. And I really love because all of these emotional juxtapositions that we've mentioned exist within the books, but the way that this season is being structured really emphasizes them in a way that makes it a more active conversation, and I think really heightens the stakes of everything. And again, I think having this paralleled on either side of episode 3 is really important. Again, Jacob Tierney did kind of reinforce that that was placed very specifically in terms of being this kind of emotional valve, like I talked about in my episode 3 discussion, the kind of, like I said, the Porter scene of Heated Rivalry. And I also think that it again helps remind us as viewers of the wider world in relation to all of this as well, and gives us something to contrast this relationship against in terms of this emotional vulnerability and this relationship. Now, that being said, we still have more Scott and Kip to see, and so I'm very interested to see because that has to come into play in episode 5 at some point, and I'll be interested to see how much and where. Also, to go back to where we ended the episode for a second, again, I think for a lot of book readers, like I said, there's information that we get in the long game about how the end of that night went for Shane that I think a lot of readers were expecting to see in the show. And while I don't know that we'll necessarily see it this season, I'm not counting it out. We might, get a reference to it in the next episode for all I know. I don't count it out completely either in reframing, because I think that there is an emotional release that will come after that moment for Shane that's obviously going to illuminate something for him, and it will be interesting to see where we are going to pick back up in episode 5, if we're going to kind of pick up with Shane having to make that decision or having already made that decision, especially within the pacing of the show, and knowing we need to get to the All-Stars game, knowing we are getting the All-Stars game based on pictures, and that based on the timeline in the book, we've got like a week, I think, between these two events. And so our timelines are getting more consolidated because we're now in the kind of main crux of the emotional reveals and reversals of these characters. We have this background that's been built that is leading to these emotional revelations, and we are about to get to them. We have a lot to go with episode 5 and 6, and I think it's going to be emotionally devastating and rejuvenating at the same time. And again, I think the reason that we can have the emotional reactions we're having to these moments is because we don't treat the emotions as trivial. We allow the emotional interiors, the stakes of the emotional interiors, to have as much weight as they do within our lives, and to feel the fullness of that, and that none of the creative choices, like I said, shy away from that, including the acting beats. I think the fact that we're not rushing through any of these beats is really stellar. We're sitting in that with these characters, the discomfort from a lot of angles, and really focusing on this emotional journey, and the music and the camera work allowing us to get a kind of version of the interior monologue that we're missing from the book, as well, of course, as the minutia of expression on our actors' faces, and getting to see all of this play out in a way that we're not privy to. And also, I think it's important too, like sometimes our characters are lying to themselves in the narrative, and seeing the reality of what the emotional truth of the moment is really something as well. Like, I think that we can see the devastation from Ilya even more clearly, or even like we are sometimes filtered through the perception of the character we're seeing things from, and they're not always seeing things as clearly as they think they are, or seeing the other's perspective. And we can know these events are coming. I knew the club was coming, but I wasn't expecting to feel as devastated by it as I was. And I'm so thankful for that. And there are all these little moments. Like I said, I've kind of just done like a broad overview, even as I've kind of tried to go play by play, but at the same time, there's no way to really fully encapsulate all of this at the same time as we have been talking probably for as long as the episode itself, or at least I've been recording for as long as the episode itself. And there's just so much to dig into, and I think that's such a joy. Everything is saying something, even though it's a very short runtime. It feels so speedy, and a lot of us really do want more, but at the same time, we're utilizing the time we're given very effectively. And it's also kind of playing in to the frenzy and the emotional payoff of a lot of that as well. And like, can you imagine like something like this being put into a movie instead of a show? Like what that would have been, again, because we really are transposing the important moments so far. And as a lover of romance, I'm not really used to seeing all of the big moments protected and preserved like this. And it's kind of mind boggling, and I am loving it. I don't remember the last time I was this enthralled with something. I don't remember the last time I've seen this kind of fandom, or at least been amidst this kind of fandom that sparked up so completely. And it's just been a joy. And so I don't know. I feel like I have barely scratched the surface of this episode, but it's one of the best episodes of TV I've seen in a while, I think. And also, it made me think back to seeing the Wicked for Good trailer, because I posted on Threads something like, the people yearn for parallelism. And so to see the parallelism play out so expertly here, and to be forwarding these emotional journeys, and to be placing these love interests on an equal playing field, getting to see the fullness of both of them. Like I said, one of the things I love about romance, I love dual point of view, and here we're seeing it at its best. Again, we're seeing a lot of these romance tropes that have been in conversation, or these romance conventions that have been in conversation, at its best here. And here we're seeing that dual point of view play out. We're getting to see the push and pull of the emotional freakouts, and the joy of two people in love, falling in love, and meeting each other eventually, but allowing both of them to live in this emotional messiness, and the promise of the happily ever after really allowing for the fullness of this emotional messiness, for us to go to these angstier spots, to the full yearning of it, because we know that we are going to have a soft landing on the other side, and the joy of that as well. And so I'm just having such a great time, and we're still doing so well, and it's just so fun to experience this with everyone right now. And before we go, I would be remiss to not mention at least a little bit the season 2 renewal. So as a treat, and as a reward for the emotional devastation that we survived with the end of the episode, they confirmed season 2. And based on some of the social media I've seen from the official account, in that they posted something with Connor and Hudson reading from the long game, I do think that that supports that a season 2 will primarily focus on the long game, but we will see. So that is very exciting, and I'm very, very interested to see where this season is going to end in terms of setting up that season 2, because we can know that we're going to have the happily ever after, the happy for now, but is it going to look exactly like what we got in the book? I don't know. So there's a lot to consider, but thank you so much for hanging out and listening to my thoughts, especially as they felt a little bit more scattered today. But I appreciate you being willing to fangirl with me, and I'm sure there's a lot more we can chat about and dig into, but thank you. Let me know what you thought of the episode, what the most emotionally devastating part was for you, how many times you've listened to all the things she said since watching the episode, how many times you've watched the episode. I've watched it like 3 or 4 times since it dropped, and I still feel like I have such a cursory understanding of the episode. Like, I feel like I was jumping around a lot in this discussion because there's so much to talk about, but at the same time, I'm trying to like give shape to the discussion, and I feel so frantic in my energy because this episode has made me feel frantic, and the editing has contributed to that. Everything was by design, but let me know what you're thinking. Like and subscribe if you feel like it. Read something good, even if it's just some fan fiction for Heated Rivalry at this point. And yeah, bye.